When I first started hiring, I didn't understand the role of passion, but I started working with game developers, and all they ever talked about was passion. And I found out why. To ship a game takes a lot of effort and often a lot of overtime. And if you don't love the game, if you don't love your work, you won't do it. And what I discovered was this applied to all jobs. And so find the person who has the skills, but also who's just driven to deliver. And then that person will generate good results, even if they have to run over you as the boss. They're so committed to the result.
Thank you so much, Ethan, for taking the time coming onto the show.
Oh, thank you, Grace, for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So can you tell us a little bit more about like how did you grow up and what brought you into tech?
So I grew up in Ohio in the Midwest and in a family full of fairly highly educated people, all in science. My dad was a chemist. My mom had been a chemist, sisters in biology, etc. And computers came out when I was a kid, and I was immediately fascinated. And so my dad got me an Apple II when I was in 7th grade, right when they first became available. And so I got into software development even before high school and taught myself to program. And eventually what I did is when I was looking to go to college, I wrote a letter to Apple Computer. And I said, I have an Apple, and when I grow up, I would love to work for you, like after college. What do I need to do? And I actually got an old-fashioned handwritten reply from someone who worked at Apple that said, well, we only hire people from these 5 colleges, and you're going to need a degree in computer engineering from one of these 5 places. And so I applied to those schools, and I went to Carnegie Mellon, but I never went to Apple. So that's how I got into it, but I ended up at other high-tech companies besides Apple.
Yeah, wow, that's a quite interesting story. By the way, like, who was the letter? Who did you send the letter to? Was that Steve Jobs or someone?
I don't think I sent it to Steve Jobs by name, but somehow I sent it. I still have it stored away somewhere, but I just sent it to Apple Computer, like their headquarters or something. And I'm old enough that, like, obviously it got put into their HR process, and they found an engineer who wrote me back. And I remember to this day, it's so strange because the letter I got back was in like this very light blue ink, which seemed just like a strange pen. It wasn't normal blue. It wasn't black. It was like this sky blue, sort of pretty color, which I guess strikes you as Apple, right? The very design forward, even then, company.
So after CMU, I saw before Amazon, you actually did a lot of like jobs in either engineering, like VP of engineering or VP of operation. What did each of these experiences teach you to prepare you for become who you are today?
I worked in a number of smaller companies and startups. I had never worked for a large company before Amazon. And I think what those jobs first taught me is that I liked leading people. I hadn't ever thought I would. I thought I'd be an engineer, and I considered being a manager like selling out to the dark side. But then I learned that I enjoyed human puzzles just as much as technical puzzles, so trying to get a set of people to work together. And what I learned in those roles is in startups, you do whatever is needed. And so I started managing all sorts of functions I had never dealt with before. So I was managing documentation and human resources and recruiting and probably some other things, training and tech support and IT. And so I learned how to manage different types of people I'd never met or worked with, and I couldn't do their jobs. And so the most interesting thing, I think, was learning to manage people where I couldn't personally do their job. And that made me a much stronger manager because I couldn't just say, well, I know the right way to do this because I've done it.
What do you think would be 3 characteristics that you have better than your peers that make you more successful today?
I have a willingness to take risk. So I'm pretty willing to make a decision and act on it, even when I'm not sure of the outcome. And that probably is the biggest. I'm relatively a perfectionist, so I try pretty hard. I put a lot of effort into being right or into completing something thoroughly, always doing all the work. And this will sound both good and bad, but I am willing to tell other people what to do. So some people are very hesitant to give direction and say, this is what we should do. But I've always been willing, I don't know, like once I'm convicted that something is right, I'm willing to tell others this is what we're going to do. It doesn't mean I don't take their input, but it does mean I'm willing to make a decision and assert a direction.
Can you give us an example of like in what kind of situation that you kind of demonstrate these things that make you say these are the characteristics that make you a more successful person?
Yeah, I think my favorite story about this happened early in my career at Amazon. We had just shipped Amazon Video, which was the video service that's now Prime Video. TiVo, the TiVo company, approached us about a partnership. And some of the leaders were inclined to pursue the partnership, but a number were opposed, and I was one of them. Going into the meeting to make the decision about the partnership, I had done the work and knew the math in my head that to do the work to ship this project would take 7% of my team's effort for the year. Well, 7% isn't very much. So somehow discussion in the meeting came around to should we do this or not? And my boss had been telling me, Ethan, you're new to Amazon. You need to take stronger charge of your team. You need to be more decisive. And so I said, there was this debate going back and forth, and our highest level boss, the senior vice president, said, well, I wouldn't do this job, but I'm going to leave. I wouldn't do this deal and work with TiVo. But no deal is perfect, and so I'm going to leave the choice to the team. And I looked at my boss and I said, Neil, his name was Neil, you've told me I need to be more in charge of my own team and make decisions about the product. Unless you order me not to, this is only going to take 7% of my team, and I'm going to do this. He just sat there. He didn't say no. And so then I had made a strong decision. I had done the work to know how much effort it was going to take. We built the product, and it turned out to be very, very successful. So in that case, I couldn't know for sure it was going to work. And in fact, it worked better than I had hoped. But the fact I gambled and I had the data, so I wasn't just telling them, oh, I'm going to do this, but it's only going to take 7% of our work, because I suspect my boss was thinking, well, it's 7%. If he's wrong, so what? It's tolerable, it's survivable. But that really started my career on a positive path at Amazon, because I got a reputation of someone who could make a decision and then who could deliver. And so that's my example of where all those things add up. And we got good results.
In terms of like professional wise, we know that you're the VP of Amazon. So can you tell us a little bit more about your day-to-day? Like what would be a day-to-day like for a VP at a big tech company?
This is a bad question in the sense that it's not very inspiring. My day is almost all meetings and email. So I like many executives, I have an executive assistant. And her full-time work almost is trying to fit people onto my calendar. When I get up in the morning, I read my email, and then I start immediately a set of meetings at 9 a.m. And often I have a meeting every 30 minutes all day, or all day except for lunch. Sometimes the meetings are longer, but often it's 30 minutes a topic. And so it's a little bit exhausting. The good part of that, the positive, is in those meetings, I get things done with my team. They bring me suggestions or problems or reports or data, and we discuss it and we reach a conclusion about what to do next. The fun part of my job is to share information that I may have from elsewhere to make sure my team has all the information, to help them feel safe making decisions. In other words, I take the responsibility if I need to and say, okay, this is what you've told me you want to do this. I will back you up in doing that. If it goes wrong, don't worry about it. Just do your best. And then what resources do you need? And so a lot of times then I need to go get them budget or headcount or get a problem resolved. And so that's my day-to-day. And my favorite parts of the day are where we can invent new things or come up with new ideas. That's what's really fun.
What do you think are like the different qualities or different skills that you need to build from like working at a startup to a big company?
A big company is a lot more about complex collaboration. You're generally working with just more people, and they're often divided into more teams. And so, unfortunately, big companies can do things small companies sometimes can't, because they have the resources, the money, the people to do it. But organizing a big group of people many of whom may not report to you, is a lot more work because other teams may have different goals than you, different priorities, and you have to negotiate and get them to buy into what you need done. To work effectively in a big company, you have to be comfortable essentially navigating human systems. That's a fancy way. Some people would say, well, what he just said in fancy words was dealing with bureaucracy. And if you just look at bureaucracy not as needless red tape, but as the overhead of large groups of people, it's true. Sometimes you also have to deal with true bureaucracy where there's rules and regulations that a smaller company might not have. I turned out to be pretty good at that, getting things done even though there's a bit more people and maybe more process. And so I loved startups, but I've had my most success in a large company.
What are some actions that you took to actively kind of like making your team the strongest within the organization?
So one of the sayings I teach my team is results are the currency of credibility, which just means do something valuable before you start suggesting changes or asking for favors. And so my teams generally focus on delivering first and then asking for stuff, or even to use a stronger word, demanding. Once we have success, I'm very brave to go to leaders, whether my boss or other leaders, and say, well, we've had all these good results. We've shown that we aren't going to waste your time or waste your people's time. But in return, I now need you to do this and whatever it is I need done. That to me is probably the main skill you need, is the skill to how are you going to explain to someone that it's important that they're going to do what you need? How do you make them feel like it's the right decision for them and make them help them feel comfortable with it? And you're not always going to be 100% successful, but getting cooperation with people is a lot about showing them that you respect them and that you value their time. Because if people feel respected and valued, they're much more likely to cooperate.
How did you pick who is going to be on your team? Besides they supposed to have the skills that they need, how do you pick? Can you give us an example of a situation that you pick candidate A instead of candidate B?
I'll tell a funny story first that I think your listeners will appreciate. I am very picky. I invest a lot in recruiting. And there is a case one day where we interviewed a candidate all day. We got to what we call the debrief at the end of the day, and we realized that we had missed a question and we weren't sure about this candidate's ability in one area. And rather than make a decision without the information, I had talked to him and I knew he was going to be staying in town overnight to see the town of Seattle where we work. And so I called him up and asked him where he was, and then I went to his hotel and interviewed him again in the lobby. The bad part of this story is what I learned is he was in fact not very good at the thing we had missed, and we didn't hire him. But the point is I went and tracked him down after work to get the information. To your question about picking between A and B, that's a case where I didn't pick B. But in other cases, I've always tried to pick the person beyond skills who has passion. When I first started hiring, I didn't understand the role of passion, but I started working with game developers and all they ever talked about was passion. And I found out why. To ship a game takes a lot of effort and often a lot of overtime. And if you don't love the game, if you don't love your work, you won't do it. And what I discovered was this applied to all jobs. And so find the person who has the skills, but also who's just driven to deliver. And then that person will generate good results, even if they have to run over you as the boss. They're so committed to the result. When I have somewhat equal candidates, I pick the person who has a track record of delivering things and who impresses me as driven to do so.
How do you test out these kind of characteristics? Because I think it's really easy to be like, oh, I'm really passionate about this.
Yep.
Like, how do you see it?
So you've asked a question. I ask people when I interview them about hiring, how do you prove out a soft skill? The first answer is you cannot absolutely do it. There's no way to know. Someone might be a very good storyteller. The normal way to do it is called behavioral interviewing. And you ask them for stories of what they've done in the past. So you ask them, tell me about the last thing that you felt really strongly about and what did you do to make that happen? And you see what their story is.
Mhm.
And generally, between body language, people who are really excited will lean in and get animated and their hands will go. But also, they'll have numerous stories. And those stories, people are less likely, not, I'm sure not completely unlikely, but they're less likely to lie about things they said they did because you can check that. Whereas
Mhm.
if you tell them, like, oh, are you passionate? Well, yes, I am. Well, what would you do if you faced an obstacle? Well, I would do everything to get over it. Those questions are easy because no one can prove it. But if I say, what did you do the last time your boss told you no? Oh, I went back to my desk and did something else, is a very different answer of, well, I went back and I got all this data and I went back and argued with him and he still said no. And so then I figured, it's very different in how they answer. So the way I interview
Mhm.
is look at what they've done, look at
Mhm.
their actual results.
So in terms of managing a team, if everybody is sort of like really passionate about their own kind of characteristic or like their own area, how do you manage a group of really enthusiastic people? And in terms of picking the candidate, do you pick the ones that are well-rounded or do you pick them with a specific secret talent?
You're always looking for the person who's an expert in their
Mhm.
category and pretty good at other stuff, somewhat
Mhm.
well-rounded. I believe that each person has a role, and I don't need my marketer to be an expert coder, nor my coder to be an expert marketer. The other thing you ask, though, is if you have a bunch of passionate people, what do you do about conflict,
Mhm.
essentially? What if they're passionate? I try to hire people who are passionate to change the world, not
Mhm.
passionate about a specific change.
Mm.
In other words, they want to deliver and have impact, but there are people, and I am one of them, who can work on different things. And as long as the work is compelling and interesting, what the work is can change. I've worked in music, I've worked in high speed networking, I've worked in games, I've worked in apps, I've worked in all these different areas.
Mhm.
And for me, what I'm passionate about is making a difference. And so I look
Mhm.
for someone like that. You can hire someone who's only passionate about writing a book or making a movie or whatever. You have to then make sure that what you want them to do is what they want to do. But the best
Mhm.
person is passionate to have great outcome. And
Mm.
then you can point them towards the outcome you need.
What you have achieved today, a lot of people probably helped you back in time. So how do you kind of created this very effective network that's not on that may not be just like a bunch of friends or something? Like
Mhm.
how do you make them to like kind of like help you in when you want to achieve something?
It is true. I didn't understand how to do this when I began my career. And early on, I got somewhat lucky because I simply worked hard and some
Mhm.
people invested in me because they saw me doing hard work. And so they're
Mhm.
like, wow, this young man has some potential because he's working hard.
Mhm.
But I learned to go to my leaders and ask them what they needed.
Mhm.
So go to them and say, look, how can I help? What do you need done? And also go to them with suggestions and say, look, I noticed this.
Mhm.
Would you like me to do something about that? Or would you
Mhm.
like me to finish this project? And managers, including myself, are constantly, we have a set of problems in our mind.
Mhm.
And so if someone comes to us and says, can I help you with your problems? You
Mhm.
tend to say, of course, I have so many. Which one would you like? And then once you help them, they're much more invested in you.
Mhm.
They're much more likely to try to help you. It's just normal
Mhm.
human nature. You help the people who help you.
Mhm.
And so I became, yeah, I'm overusing this word help, but I
Mhm.
became very helpful. Even if sometimes I screwed up and sometimes my help wasn't very effective because I didn't have the skill, the
Mhm.
good intentions behind it made up for a lot. Because
Mhm.
there were some times where I'm like, oh, I'm going to help you with this. And then I made a total disaster out of it. But even still, they're like, well, okay, that's a mess, but at least you were trying. And
Yeah.
compared to someone else who wasn't doing anything, even that was extra credit.
Now we're getting into the fun part, which is executive answer interview questions.
All right.
Ethan is super great at it. Everyone should check out his website, Easy Coach, and I'll link it in our website. And the number one question is, if I never really had background in doing something, how do I get a job of doing something? For example, if I want to work at a tech company doing marketing, but I never had marketing experience, how should I do the career pivot?
Yeah, career pivots are very difficult,
Mhm.
can be very difficult. they require two things. They require that you may have to invest some in self-educating. In other words, if you've never done any marketing, that could be okay, but if you don't know anything about marketing, that's going to be really hard. And it's going to be even harder for some like hard skills, whether it's finance or law or whatever. You can't just decide one day, I'd like to be a lawyer with no background in law. And so part of it is you may have to go back to school for education, or you may have to self-teach. A lot of programmers are self-taught, and so you can choose to become a self-taught developer, and maybe a self-taught marketer. The second thing is you may have to step back in your career from a level viewpoint. In other words, I might be a very high level as, say, a software developer, but if I decide I then want to switch to marketing, I may have to go backwards or down or whatever you want to call it to a much more entry-level role. And some people can do that financially, and some can't. Some people, their ego can't handle that. To change career, you don't always have to do these things, but you may need to both invest in education and take a more humble role. The good news is, if you do it well, sometimes you can step sideways by finding a job that blends the two. So you can say, for example, in your situation, let's say I was a programmer and I wanted to be a marketer. What I might say is, does the marketing group have any programmers working for them building tools? Do they have someone building social media tools or email tools? Can I go work on that team, and I will learn about marketing by building things for them? And so I would go there in steps. And that's the kind of thing that tends to work. Just waking up one day and deciding, if you pick two very different things, I'm a lawyer and now I want to be a painter, there's no easy path between those two.
What are some other actions that you may take? For example, if you want to switch companies into like a completely different industry, what would be like the top 3 action that you take?
Well, a lot of people talk about internships is a way to do it. So you take a risk and say, if you're in a position where you can do this, you take a risk and say, take a bet on me and I'll work for no pay, or pay me on a contract for 3 months. In other words, reduce the risk for the company that's going to take a chance on you. That's one thing you could do. The second thing you can do is, even though I've been very successful in large companies, go to a small company, because as I said earlier in our talk, small companies, you do more things. And so small companies it's more possible to maybe find a leader who will take a risk, not on what your skills are, but on who you are. And so to more bet on your intelligence or your track record than your skills. Large companies are a little bit more rigid on this, I would say, because they have job descriptions and job codes and job families and recruiting departments, all of which are sort of structured. Whereas if you go to a small startup, they may be very much open to, we just need help. And if you say you want to try it, sure, we'll give you a try, because we have no one at all doing that today. And so you doing it badly is better than no one.
So one of the popular questions in interviews is, what's your greatest strength and weakness, especially weaknesses? Like, how do you answer a question like this?
So the what is your greatest weakness question is a classic. And the answer that has become almost a joke that you don't give is, oh, I sometimes work too hard. Because it's really a secret strength that you're falsely presenting as a weakness. You're trying to say, well, I'm the super hard worker. Point is, you have to answer it honestly. And I think knowing your weaknesses, I'd rather hire someone who knows their weaknesses than either someone who denies having any weakness, or someone who is unaware of their weaknesses. And so, for example, I really struggle with deep detail. I'm a high-level person. I'm an instinctive decision maker, and it's very hard for me to spend a lot of time, particularly alone, working with deep detail. And so I tell people this, and I have had, by the way, what is your greatest weakness, or a variation of that question, cost me a job, where I told someone what I don't do, and he said, well, that's what I'm looking for, and we agreed that I wasn't going to work there. But that's okay, because he wanted exactly what I didn't want to do. And
Mm-hmm.
so if I had taken that job or not been truthful, I'd have ended
Mm-hmm.
up with a job where I was being asked and expected to do something I wasn't very good at.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people fear that question, and rather you should look at it as, let me tell you honestly what I'm not that good at. And if this job
Mm-hmm.
really requires a lot of that, I'm probably only going to be unhappy and fail.
Yeah, oh my God. I think that's like people really underestimate like how much like being honest can actually help them to like achieve a successful career. And I
Yes.
think like I really like your example of like actually that's like I really appreciate that you're actually sharing it with people because like most people are not really vulnerable enough to admit that they have a weakness or like this is actually costing them something. Like I feel like people are really fear of, oh, what if I can't get this? But think about if you can actually get a job that you actually hate, you may quit anyway. So may as well just like pick something that's like fits you better.
Yeah, and I recognize that advice requires someone who's not in immediate danger of losing their apartment or their
Mhm.
car. You have to be, well, some people are in the situation where they need anything that will pay their rent, but
Yeah.
many high-tech workers are not. They can afford to
Mhm.
be a little bit picky or at
Mhm.
least choosy. And I would just recommend, why would you want a job where
Mhm.
your weakness is something they're really going to dislike? I'd rather say this is exactly my weakness. And
Mhm.
if you want who I am, I'm going to be terrific. But if you don't want who I am, please tell me, because I'm not going to be someone different than
Mhm.
who I am.
So curious about like so one of the other popular interview question is like what kind of challenge do you face in your last job and then how do you solve it?
For these popular interview questions, you can know they're coming. And so you should
Mhm.
absolutely have your answers a little bit thought up. And it doesn't mean like concoct a story, but you shouldn't be like, oh, I've never thought about being challenged. You shouldn't have to really think about that. And so, again, I would say answer honestly. The thing
Mhm.
that should be easy in an interview, the great thing about behavioral interviewing, is I should just be telling stories from my history. And all of us
Mhm.
are born storytellers. From the time we're little kids, we're mommy, mommy, daddy, daddy, can I tell you what I did at school today? And so we're all born storytellers, or grown
Mhm.
up storytellers anyway. And so in a case like that, the story that we're looking for with a challenge is, what have you worked on that was hard, that
Mhm.
pushed you? And it doesn't actually, everybody thinks they have to tell a story of a challenge where they succeeded, but actually
Mhm.
it can be more endearing even to tell a story of something that you worked really hard on and tried and it didn't work out,
Mhm.
but then what did you learn, or what did you change?
Mm.
Stories of failure, surprisingly, can get you a job. Not everything you say in the interview has to be about failures. That would be bad. But telling a story of a big challenge that you didn't overcome and
Mhm.
how it changed you
Mhm.
can be extremely motivational. For those overcoming challenges stories, though, the key is, what was the challenge? Why was it hard? And what
Mhm.
did you do? And then what was the outcome? Did it work, or what did you learn? In fact, in either case, being able to say what you learned is probably
Mhm.
what they're after.
Can you give us an example of like if you are facing this question, how would you answer it?
I face lots of challenges. I just said it's not bad to talk about a failure. So let me think about, I think an example where I faced a challenge and I probably
Mhm.
failed, and I learned a lot from it, is almost 10 years ago, I started running Amazon's App Store, the App
Mhm.
Store that now runs on our Kindles, Fire TV, and supports the Alexa Skills Store. But at one point, we really wanted to grow that store
Mhm.
to be competitive on Android phones with the Google Play Store.
Mhm.
And 4 years in, I had quite a big team and we had built out the store globally, but I couldn't figure out how to compete with Google very
Mhm.
much, because the Google Play Store is very good and it
Mhm.
comes already installed on everyone's Android phone if you use
Mhm.
Android. And
Mhm.
so I couldn't figure out a way to get people to stop using that and instead
Mhm.
install an app store from Amazon. I was asked to do that and I became very discouraged because I didn't have an idea for it. I didn't have a solution, but that's what
Mhm.
my management wanted. And I think the challenge was, I had this really big problem that I couldn't
Mhm.
solve. And it's not that I didn't try. We tried several things that I
Mhm.
won't go into all the details. But
Mhm.
after each of those failed, I started to feel hopeless. So in the end, the key is, I didn't succeed at the business. And then even worse, I started to become dispirited and my team could see that. So what I eventually did is I went to another team. I said, okay, I'm out of ideas in this role. We need to make space for someone who's motivated and has fresh ideas on this challenge. Let me go and someone else come. And what I learned after I had switched, it's when I switched to working for Twitch TV within Amazon, I learned I was much happier and much more successful in the new role, that I should have made the move earlier. I stuck with it and fought beyond where I was effective. And so the learning I would take away is when I realize I'm out of ideas and no longer motivated and starting to feel demotivated to where my team can see it, it's time to make a change. And so that's one way I would answer that question of a big challenge where I did all I could and I stayed and stuck with it. But when it was clear I wasn't going to be successful, I made room for somebody else and went and did something else where I was successful. Oh, well, that's a high risk answer, right? Like if I told a hiring executive that I failed at a task and then left, I would have to be very convincing about why that was a good, why they should feel confident in me. But I think if I were selling that, if I were telling that story to a hiring manager right now, if you were a hiring manager, I would say, this shows is that I will give my all. And then if I can see that that isn't going to be enough, I will come to you professionally and say, I can't achieve this for you without help or a change. What would you like to do? And I think most bosses would be like, that's great. You're going to do everything you can. You have a track record of success. But if you hit a wall, you're clearly willing to admit that. Because one of the hardest things can be dealing with someone who won't admit that they're struggling. They just know everything's fine, when it's obviously not fine.
Curious, like, what do you like about Twitch? I mean, I love Twitch, but like, I'm just curious, like, how, like, do you play a lot of games, or like, what do you like about it?
I play only a few games, but what I like about it is the community involvement. I like the fact that Twitch is interactive, and while it is primarily used for games, that it's never been limited to purely games. There's so much more that happens. But what I really love is the fact that people come together and they talk and they hang out and they help each other and they volunteer. To put a word on it, which I used earlier, Twitch communities are communities of passion. They're communities where whether you love a particular game or you love a particular player of a game or the way they play the game or just the way they are, and that includes non-game content, people follow and support broadcasters on Twitch because they found something they love. And so the most powerful thing I've heard Twitch customers say is, when I found Twitch, I found home. And what they mean is not that Twitch itself was their home, but they found a group of people that felt like family. And on Twitch, if you're someone who really loves Star Wars Wookiee trivia and only about Wookiees, there are 10 other people on Twitch just as into it as you are. And so even though you have a very small interest that not a lot of people share, you can find that one set of people that are just as into that as you are. And for any topic. And that's really neat. The person who taught me about Twitch culture, a product manager there named Bobby Scarneman, Bobby taught me that Twitch is the place where you can be the best version of yourself. You don't have to bring anything from your life to Twitch you don't want to. If you're participating in chat or if you're helping as a moderator, whatever you're doing, you're only exposing the part of yourself you want to show. And it might be that you feel unattractive or whatever, or ineffective or lonely at home, but you only have to bring the best of yourself to that community of people who share your interest. Now, some people would say, oh, well, bringing the best of yourself is a fancy way of saying lying about all your faults or omitting them. Yeah, I don't believe that. I believe that you can be in that situation, you're bringing the best of yourself in that context. And I think it's incredibly valuable and a huge cure for loneliness. It's not a complete cure, but the fact that you can hang out with people that get you and that fit with you makes tons of people very happy.
Another popular interview question is, if a supervisor gives you a criticism, how do you take it?
You say thank you. The very first thing people fail is they argue. And the idea is criticism is a gift. feedback is a gift. And when you're given a gift, you say thank you. You may say other things also, but it's very important to sincerely say, well, thank you for sharing that with me. And the reason you need to say that is, one, I hope you feel thankful that someone took the time to give you input. But two, if you ever want input again, if you fight the input, people will just say, well, why bother? You know, Ethan can't get any better. He won't listen. Let's just fire him because he's not going to change. And I don't want that, right? I want to be told if I'm not doing something well, I need to know. The second thing you then do is you may need to ask clarifying questions. In other words, maybe you know that that's a weakness of yours or something you should work on, but you may have to ask for detail if you don't. Like, oh, I thought the report was great. Can you tell me what wasn't good enough or what you felt could be better? And then you may need to ask for help. You may need to say, well, I'm not sure I can do a better financial analysis of the problem. That isn't my skill. What should I do? How can I get help? So there are things you should do, but the key, the number one key is try not to become defensive. Even if it's worded as a criticism of you as a human being, it's normally intended to be a criticism of the work. And all of us can get better at our work. And so you have to look at it as an opportunity to grow, not a condemnation of who you are. And so many people feel that any criticism is a condemnation of who they are as a human. And we can't stand that. All of us will fight back if I feel like I'm being devalued as a person. To maintain my self-esteem, I have to reject it. But if I feel that I'm learning how to do better work, I can accept that.
So what would be like one piece of advice that like you've heard people giving you early on and then you find it's really, really useful later on?
I'm loud, I'm big. I happen to be 6'2". I speak loudly. I think I was given advice to listen more, and also in some circumstances to realize that I need to sit down. I need to make other people comfortable before they're going to share. So I need to come down on their level, lower my voice, maybe stop gesturing with my hands and be patient. The point of the advice was realizing that just who I am, everyone has some sort of person who irritates them or threatens them. And I was that person for some people. And so I needed to be aware, for some people, my personality isn't a natural fit. And that's true of everyone. So for me, though, it was learning who those people are and how to help them be more comfortable. And so the simple advice, making it really very simple, was listen more. That was the advice I was given.
So like our last question, but not really one question, is, so what would be a book you recommend us to read, and who would be your dinner guest, and in the end, who made the biggest impact in your career?
My favorite book recommendation is a book called Decisive by Chip and Dan Heath. And Decisive is about the science of decision making, but specifically, you've said several times, action oriented. It provides a simple model for you and I, regular people, to make better decisions, not only at work, but in our lives. And I use it all the time. I've learned to make somewhat better decisions as a result of this book. So that would be I have not yet had anyone read that book and tell me, I think this is useless. I got nothing from it. And many people really love it, but I've never had anybody say it wasn't good. Oh, so if this is normally like, if I could have dinner with any one person, who would it be? Is that, or a bigger dinner?
It would be the same.
So for me, of course, the answer I can't get away from there is Jesus Christ. You know, that I can give you a living person also, but it would be so fascinating to talk to, whether you believe Jesus didn't exist, in which case if I could have him for dinner, I would know, or was just a historical figure, or was God. Anyway, I win. Like, this dinner is going to be fantastic.
What would you talk to him? Like, what would you ask him? Or like, what are you guys going to eat that day?
Well, I guess it should be lamb contextually. So I should have lamb with Jesus. But no, obviously the first question I'd want to ask is, are you really God? But assuming we went beyond that, then I'd whether he is or not, I would love to know then how he became who he was, and like it would be interesting to ask him, do you have any idea this stuff you said is now followed by 1 billion people around the world? Like, did you know, or did you expect that? There's so many things though I'd want to know.
That's fascinating. Like you're the first person said like this answer.
Yeah, leadership is my thing, right? And so if you just even look at the history, this is a man who started one of the great religions of the world. So as a leader, he has incredible interest to me, and as a public speaker, because his speeches are memorialized in the most printed book on earth. If I were to pick a modern person, it would be some great leader also. So similar thing.
For sure. Who do you think in the modern life is a great leader that you want to meet, or you already meet but you want to invite to your dinner?
Oh, invite to dinner, a great leader now. I will remain politically neutral for a second. I would say I would like to talk to any living president, just because of the decisions they have to make and the choices they have to make, and being responsible for, and if I generalized I could even say any world leader. If we talked about living presidents and I had to pick, I would say Barack Obama, just because he had so many challenges as being the first Black president, and being very young when he was president, younger than many other presidents. So I would love to hear what he learned, and all the questions you've asked me. What was your toughest decision, and who is your first mentor? And yeah, it would be great.
Last question is, who made the biggest impact in your life, either career or life-wise?
I've had many mentors who've impacted me, and of course my parents, right? Just they raised me to be very driven and very education minded, and so I got a lot out of that. But I guess if I had to pick one person who had the most impact on me, it happens that the current chancellor of the University of California in San Diego, so the guy who runs the whole university, was a young, new assistant professor, like a brand new professor at Carnegie Mellon when I was an undergrad. And he took me on as an undergraduate researcher. So basically a lab rat in his lab. And I got to work for this guy who's risen to become chancellor of the University of San Diego, which is a pretty big responsibility. And I got to work with him for years and know him. And I would say he was the first boss who ever trusted me and let me do things, like encouraged me and believed in me. And he let me do some relatively crazy things.
Like what?
He had a research contract with a company in Germany. And I was supposed to be like a subordinate sort of assistant researcher on this contract. And I went and negotiated our next research contract with them. And the reason I was able to do that was just, I was willing to ask. I was willing to say, well, you should do this, this, and this with us. And, I was just a total out of control kid. The result of those conversations was that they did much more work with Carnegie Mellon than they would have. And I think one of the skills I have was that I was willing to ask the uncomfortable questions. And this boss was very like that, like just throw it out there and see what they say. And so he trusted me to do it. And so it kind of got me started on the idea that taking the story I told earlier with TiVo, he was the first person who showed me that if you take risks, sometimes those risks will work out and you'll get some big gain. And so I got a ton from working for him as a student.
First of all, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Can you tell us a little bit more about like the Easy Coach? Where can we find you? And just like in general, why you started? And would love to have a plaque for you.
Oh, well, thank you. So you can find me on twitch.tv / Ethan Evans, just my name, or on YouTube as Ethan Evans VP for Vice President. And I have a website, www.ethanevansvp.com. And so you can find me in any of those places. And I started what I do on that. I was doing a lot of coaching at Amazon of my employees, and I realized I couldn't coach any more people. My calendar was very full, and I was turning people away, and I felt bad about that. And so I stepped back and said, how can I just do this at much more scale? How can I, instead of coaching 2 or 3 people a week or 4 or 5 people a week, how can I reach 100? How can I reach 1,000? And I realized the only way to do that was online. And so it's true that if I coach, if I offer wisdom or answer questions on Twitch, it's not as personalized as if I'm speaking to only you and I can get your whole story and your exact situation. But a lot of people tell me, I get feedback all the time in email or on LinkedIn, I listened to what you did and I learned something, or I got a new job from it. So I know it's working, and I did it because it lets me reach so many more people. And so that's why I started it, as a chance to scale teaching. And I love to teach and share.
For sure. I like definitely feel like I benefit from it too. And like I am a really big fan of like your show, and a lot of the tips you mentioned are actually really actionable. And I feel like those are really the advice that you don't really get from, like, you don't expect from like someone who is super senior, like you mentioned these things. It's like a really just like my peers could give me this advice. I feel like it's really, really helpful. A big plus for you. And thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Grace, for having me. I really enjoyed it.